Good, that didn't knock anything over. Can everybody hear me okay? We good? Awesome. Okay, so this is fantastic. We've got a packed room. It's great to be at a developers conference or developer-centric kind of conference and see lots of people in here to hear about fonts. And hopefully you're not all here to gripe at me later on about the fact that us designers want you to use them. I was hoping I'd get a few laughs with that. Because a lot of what I'm going to talk about are the ways that you should be thinking about and acting on implementing web fonts in order to not kill the performance of your website and therefore kill the user experience. So responsive typography is a number of different things that we're going to talk about. And the reason I've been trying to focus on this phrase and defining it is that it's different from responsive web design. It's part of it. It's very important, and they're really tied. But there are other elements to it that really matter. So a little bit more about me. I am the co-founder of H&W Design, and quite simply, it is me with my wife, husband and wife. It's that simple. And we've been working together for a while, and we do projects for universities and tech companies and schools. And we've tried and focus more on the design and strategy than necessarily on the building. But along the way, I've ended up really learning a lot about the nuts and bolts. And so that's really what I want to try and share to you is the blending of the aesthetics and the implementation. Because I like to tinker. And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's a carburetor, one of two that's on a 45-year-old car that I own and drive quite often. And that, again, is another thing that's this weird blend of art and science, because anybody that's ever tried to tune a carburetor, much less two of them or more, knows that there is no one rule, and if you don't have both sides of your brain engaged, your car is never going to run. I've also done a lot of things that involve bicycles. I've built a lot of bicycle wheels. I've raced on a bunch of bicycles, and I've done that for a long time. And that, again, building a bicycle wheel, there's an art to that, but there's also a lot of science involved to make something that's round and straight and durable. It's a recurring theme. And this has actually nothing to do with it other than the fact that I love to walk my dog and I love to take pictures, and I do that an awful lot. So probably the bulk of my social media output is either tweeting from conferences like this or around Turner Reservoir in the morning with my dog Tristan, whom you can follow on Twitter at @apropercollie if you're interested. But he doesn't tweet much about things other than snacks and dog walks. So this recurring theme of tinkering, of looking at the ways things connect. I mean, I studied graphic design, but I've also spent several years as a .NET developer and a server infrastructure manager, and just about everything in between. And so I've always had that curiosity to look at these intersections. And so what we're going to talk about today is some real issues that I think we have as an industry about the rules separating art and science. And understanding the value of the different hats that we have to wear. Because we all have to wear more than one. And if you're not, it would pay well to learn how to wear a couple more. Maybe not as your core competency, but study your adjacencies. So if you're doing front-end development, understanding a little bit more about the back end will make you a better fit. Understanding a little bit more about design will help you understand why a designer is asking you to do something in a particular way, to see that maybe you'll know a better way, you'll know a better how to the why, but if you don't know to ask the question, then oftentimes you just end up at odds, and that's a real shame. So I'm going to talk about exactly what I mean when I say responsive typography, and I'm going to talk about the 4 Ps. And I'll get into those in just a minute, but I tried to come up with a snappy way, as authors do, to help you remember the things that I think are really important about responsive typography. So we're going to come back to that in just a minute. So first, I want to talk about art and science. And this is something that has always been a natural blend for me. And it's something that always seemed strange to me, that was very separated. I've been involved in this industry as long as I've been a working professional. And in every single job I've ever had, there has been some form of enforced separation. And if you think about some of the most well-known artists of our time, or of any time, because we're not that old, I'm close, but not quite. Da Vinci was a brilliant scientist and inventor and artist. And if he were working today and alive today, you could bet he would code, because he would be curious and he would want to figure it out. Johannes Vermeer was a fabulous painter from a century or two later, and pioneered painting techniques to represent light and bring forth that kind of realism that was unmatched for centuries and has only been understood, perhaps in its truest extent, within the last 10 years. And that was figured out by this guy, Tim Jennison, a software developer, the guy who created Lightwave 3D. I mean, this guy's no slouch when it comes to programming and understanding development and software engineering, but also curious about the how and the why behind the aesthetics of this. So that really got me thinking again about this separation between art and science and the way we build things in design and technology. So this quote, I think, summed it up really well. Is he an artist or is he an inventor? Was Da Vinci an artist or an inventor? Well, the problem is that we force people to choose, and we enforce these divisions in the way we work, and that makes it even worse. I can't think of a better way to express this than to ask anybody that knows about painters and say, do you think there's possibly an artist, a painter, dedicated to his craft out there that doesn't understand how paint is made? A sculptor that doesn't understand the materials with which they work, a printmaker who doesn't know everything about the processes by which they etch their plates or their stones. Well, design is no different. We have to understand the things that we're making and the materials with which they're made. In the same intimacy that we do with print and ink on paper, we have to understand pixels and CSS and HTML. I don't think there's any way that we can get away from that. So art and science and design and development really are two peas in a pod. That would have been better if that transition worked. And I say two peas in a pod, not two sides of a coin, because if it's two sides of a coin, you can still only look at one side at once, and I think that's a mistake. You have to look at these things together. They need to be adjacent so they can inform one another. So I've spent a bunch of time talking about this, and I don't want to kind of burn up the time that we have, because I've got lots I want to talk to you about, but it informs everything about how to use type well on the web. So what do we mean by this, and why do we keep saying web typography and not just typography? Well, because it's more. It's like saying, why can't it just be design? Well, it's not just design, it's web design, because web design has actually more considerations to it than just a traditional graphic design job. So I don't think that we can. I don't think that we can let go of that word web when we're talking about typography or design or development, because there are particular implications about the method of delivery that affect what we're talking about. So I think this is a good way to kind of capture this. Fred Astaire was a marvelous dancer, but Ginger Rogers has to do everything that he did backwards and in heels. So that's my analogy with typography on the web. It has to do everything that typography does in print, but then we have to think about the delays, the latency, rendering on different operating systems and platforms. What are the fallbacks? What are the conditions under which this will load or not? There's all sorts of things that we have to think about, and never mind the limitations of just how the browsers have implemented all of these standards or these emerging standards. So it has to do all of these things that we know about type, or maybe might like to know about type, and then it's got to do more. It has to react to the environment, because our canvas is constantly changing. We're not ever really working on a fixed piece of paper. We're working on screens that are constantly changing and in flux and constantly getting bigger and smaller. 27-inch iMacs are really common, and so are watches these days that can run apps. So our design language and what we use to convey meaning has to change as well and has to adapt, because this is only going to increase. I think we have to recognize that currently, and for the past 3 years, Amazon has been selling more ebooks than print ones for 3 years. So the age in which we can consider print in only one way and type in only one way is over, and it's really not going to come back. So we have to think about why type, because as these things change, there's very few things that can stay constant. So type is the voice of your words, or as Steve Madison put it, they're the clothes that your words wear. And I think that's really a great way of looking at it. But if we think about this, the words simply, the text spells out words, but you can convey, you can emote just by the letter styles that you choose. So that gets the point across in a fairly dry and uninteresting way, but I think that says it with a little bit more feeling. they need to be able to be read before they can be understood and acted upon. Now again, this gets the point across from a very powerful speech, but I think this says it in a way that is a little bit more tied to a time period. It's tied to a way of reading, and we're used to seeing a phrasing like that in a history book, so this kind of evokes that a little bit. It also has letter forms that are a little bit clearer and easier to read that flow together than something said in Helvetica that's very closed. So little things like that add up, and that's why the typeface that you choose matters so much. Legible means that you can read it. And that's only half the battle, because readable means you might actually want to. So this is not quite as compelling as this. Now these may be small nuances, but they certainly add up, and when your screen gets smaller and smaller, and there are fewer and fewer other things on it to convey the voice and tone of the design, or to get a message across, or to carry a brand for your client or your own organization, type is the only thing left on the screen to do it. So we need to consider that and make sure that we're actually speaking in the tone that we would like our users to hear. So this brings us to a real dilemma in our lives as designers and developers, because there's a lot of things that we have to admit that we don't know and we can't know. So we don't know what the screen size is. We don't really know what the capabilities of the device are, although we can react to them. But we don't know what else they're doing at the time. And I point this out because some of you in here are tweeting and typing, and some are doing work, and that's totally okay. I'm not trying to call anybody out. But I'm pointing out that whatever you're doing on that screen has a portion of your attention, and whatever's going on this screen has a portion of your attention. And that has nothing to do with what kind of device you're using right now, because some are on laptops, some are on tablets, and some are on phones. I don't know what the depth of focus is, because at some point you'll be completely absorbed in that task, and at other times I might have cracked a joke and you might be looking up here. So whoever designed the site that you're surfing or working on right now doesn't know how much you're paying attention. I don't really know why you're there. And I harp on these things because we have to let go the idea of a mobile context of use. That's a fantasy. There's always some context of use that has greater or lesser focus, more or less attention, whether it's one eye and one thumb, as like Luke Wroblewski likes to talk about on mobile devices, or on a desktop. You have more than one browser window, you have more than one app, you have the TV going, you have somebody talking up on a stage. So all of these things add up to varying levels of engagement. And as you take all of these things into consideration, and then as you look at what is or isn't on the screen at the time, again, the only thing left is the type. So when we look at this, this is a little bit of a cheat. This is looking at the mobile version of the BBC website expanded to a desktop view. But my point is that you don't really get much information when there's no type on the screen. So it's a news website. They want to get the news across. So clearly it's pretty important that we actually have some text. Now, what I think is a shame is they're doing a brilliant job technically with this, and from a UX perspective, it's not that bad either. What they've done is their entire mobile site environment is all one responsive site, and they happen to be serving something different on the desktop, but I think that's going to go away within the next 6 months or so, and everything will be served through something like this. And I think that makes an awful lot of sense. But as you take away other things on the screen, what you're left with is information that's very consumable, but there's nothing about what website you're on. You don't have any kind of sense of branding or voice. And one of the things about the BBC is it has this tremendous sort of sense of authority, and a lot of that is conveyed through their typography when you look at their broadcast work. But they've really left it lacking when you look at it online. Now we look at another site on the phone. If anybody's familiar with the New Yorker, you look at that, and we could cover that banner up top. That actually wasn't there in the first relaunch of their responsive site a couple months ago. That was actually an addition a few weeks later. And I think it's completely superfluous, because all you have to do is look at Irvin, that typeface that News Desk is set in, and if you've ever seen that magazine, you know exactly what you're looking at. Type is their voice. It's their brand. And you know it the instant that you see it. So they've done a really effective job of carrying forth their brand in that view of the website, even with no logo in sight. So I think that's the amount of time I want to devote to the importance of type, because we really could spend a whole day talking about that. What I do want to get to is responsive typography. And so if this is important and we take this as a given, then how do we make this stuff part of our work life without sacrificing performance and everything else? So we want to focus on these 4 Ps. Performance. We want to select fonts with care. We don't want to block the page load. We don't want to negatively impact our infrastructure or the end user's experience. We want to be progressive. We want to embrace progressive enhancement in the right way so that devices that don't support at font face, which is about 350 million plus devices running Opera Mini, so don't kid yourself, it's still a real issue if your market is in some areas of the world. And you also need to make sure that when things break, your design still holds up. So we're going to talk a little about how you deal with flash of unstyled text and handle the U. Don't leave it unstyled. We can work with that. Proportion is also tremendously important because as screen sizes change, and again with the number of distractions, you don't want to hold the same proportions of headings to body copy or else they're really going to look ungainly and you're not going to provide the best experience on that size and scale device as you could while still conveying the meaning and intent of the design. And we want to not forget about polish because it is all of those little details that take you past being an adequate website to get the news to being a pleasurable reading experience that you want to return to. Because we can get our news anywhere, we can get our entertainment stuff anywhere, but what's really important is making sure that the experience is one that is easy, enjoyable, fulfilling, perhaps even delightful, because as much as the paper goes away, this is the only way we have to capture that experience of conveying knowledge in that way. So let's talk a little bit about performance. Let's see what we're talking about here. Now, a little bit again about typography. Really good typography is not using everything. It's not going through your font menu and saying, well, just because we can use all these web fonts, I can finally get Comic Sans reliably on the screen. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to combine it with Papyrus because that's just the ultimate combination. The more typefaces you use in your design, the more fractured the voice is in your site. It's the reason why when you go to a website that's crammed full of ads from a lot of different places, it feels very fractured because those ads are all bringing with it their own typography and their own voice. And so you have a lot of voices talking and you have a lot of cacophony and not a lot of unity in your experience. And you really want to try and avoid that. So that goes hand in hand with performance. Don't use a ton of typefaces. Use 1 or 2 with a couple different variations, and you can provide the clarity with a broad range of weights without having that sort of cacophony of different voices. It can be a lot more unified, and that also helps with your performance. So you want to make sure that you load only what you need. Now what we see here is the typeface that's used for the headings in this presentation, and what we want to make sure we understand is this is the typeface. It's a family. There's a whole bunch of different variations of it, but they're all drawn around the same visual theme. That is a font. Really what we're talking about technically is a file, but it's a file that contains the information for a single weight and or variant. Bold, bold italic, light, ultralight. All of those are individual fonts. And every time you add one of those into your design and use it on the web, that has a cost. So we have to mind our budget. We have to mind our performance budget just in here, just as we do with every other library and plugin that we're loading. And we can do that. And just to underscore how difficult this can be, the default with a lot of designers when they have not worked with web fonts very often is to experiment. And they go in and they check a lot of boxes. And actually, by default, when Typekit launched, they would enable every single weight and variant of a font that you just added to your kit, adding an enormous amount to the download of the page. That's, if you can't see that number in the corner, it's 449K. And when Typekit launched, and all the services launched initially, that was a per-page download. It was not cacheable. Thankfully, they fixed that. But what's more important is only enable the ones that you really need, and all of a sudden it's down to 120K. Now that's getting down to something that's a little bit more palatable. Some people might argue that, and they might want you to have a little bit less, but it is a one-time load. Then the only thing that happens with font services on every subsequent page load is just a tiny callback to log the page load to deal with licensing. So it's relatively easy to manage this aspect of performance, but there's another aspect of performance which is perceived performance that we want to get at as well. So this starts to blend being progressive and being performant. Now what I have here is the code from Google Web Fonts. And if you grab this code, the top half, down the script tag, that's their sort of advanced code. And then in the no script tag, we've got a line to embed CSS. So right there, we've taken care of two important considerations. One, we're using the JavaScript to load, and it has an async flag, so that means it's not going to block page render when JavaScript is enabled. And then you have CSS wrapped in a no script tag, so in the environments where JavaScript is not present, then people can still get the web fonts and your design can still hold up. But we want to focus on the top half of this because we can recognize that in most cases JavaScript is present and available, so we can count on that to do a few important things. And one of the things that this will do is supply some loading classes because it's using the Google Web Font Loader. And those loading classes are some of the keys to dealing with progressive enhancement. So progressive enhancement is making sure that we're giving a good baseline experience and then building up from there. And the reason that we can do that using the Web Font Loader is it does inject these helper classes into our HTML element. So I'm going to come back to FOUT again, because this is the most common complaint about using web fonts, is that delay of having anything show up on the screen. And I contend that for the last 4 years, this is entirely our own fault, because the tools are there for us to deal with it. Now, this is what you would see typically during the loading process. Either a fallback font there in the blog post on the left, or nothing on the screen at all with some random underlines waiting for text to fill in. And sadly, what happens on the right is far more common now, because that's what all the browser vendors have defaulted to, is hiding web fonts or displaying any content for up to 3 seconds, waiting for that asset to load, and then it will show in the fallback font if it still hasn't loaded. And if you only have 5 seconds before 75% of your mobile users bail because your page hasn't loaded, you're burning 3 of them waiting for the fonts, and that's a real shame. So instead, what we do is use the Web Font Loader to supply something that doesn't rely on a web font. Because what you want to see is this. And that delay can be a real killer, especially if you're on a high latency cell connection. I mean, it's, trying to demonstrate something to somebody or show a client. It's a real killer. They're not going to want to go with that, and it's not going to be a great experience for the user. So we want to make sure we use these. Those classes get injected during the loading process of the page when you're using the Web Font Loader. And this is done by default with Typekit and Google. Monotype and fonts.com has their own set of classes, but it's the same idea. And any other source that's linking CSS can be piped through the Web Font Loader to get these classes added to your page. So as soon as you have that, you have the tools to beat FOUT. You have the tools to beat bad experience in loading web fonts. Because what you can do is, instead of just providing this, where in your body copy it's Trade Gothic, then Helvetica, and Arial, if you add this next line, all of a sudden, when WF inactive class is present, they get something that just specifies Helvetica or Arial. So content will be on the screen nearly instantly. So that gets us back to an even playing field. It may not be styled yet. It might look a little bit jumbled, but we can fix that because now we have this class in which we can use font size, line height, and letter spacing that are universally supported in all browsers in order to fine-tune those fallback fonts. So that way, during this loading process, our design won't reflow. And should those web fonts never load, it will still maintain the integrity of our design. It might not be perfect, but it's going to be better than your navigation wrapping and your paragraph breaks being all completely off. Now, and this has been around since 2010. I wrote an article about this for fonts.com in 2011. It's still not commonly used. Thankfully, more people are starting to write about it. Jason Santamaria wrote about it in his book. I've written about it in mine, and more people are starting to be aware of these techniques. So hopefully more of you will take this back, and we can turn the tide a little bit on the interest and the sort of acceptance of using web fonts in the developer community, because it's really getting a bad rap simply because we're not using the tools that we have at hand. So here's a little demonstration. This is what the page looks like. And this is screenshots of a real web page, so, and I'll give you access to some source code to play with as well. This is what it should look like with the web fonts loaded. Now pay attention to the spacing and the headers at the top of the screen, the top of the content, and the navigation. Now this is what happens during the loading process when there's no correction in the fallback CSS. You see some line breaks shift. You see subtle changes in the physical space that headings take up. But if we apply a little bit of correction, things start to tighten up and they start to look a little bit more like we intend. And then when the web font finally loads, it's a very subtle shift, almost imperceptible. But now it's in those web fonts. And that was a very easy correction to make. It only took me about half an hour or so of tweaking the loading condition CSS. And all of a sudden, there's just really no issue with that anymore, because what people get is the fallback look that's already tuned, and then it slides into the web fonts, and they hardly see anything move around at all. So it's sort of like a JPEG coming in rough and then filling in with better resolution. So it's really important that we keep that in consideration. And then finally, I'm just coming back again here to reminding ourselves that we need to think about what works during that process, that load process, or the failure condition, because it's the web. Things just don't work sometimes. But by being backwards compatible, in this case, we're also being friendly to those millions of devices using Opera Mini, because they're going to get the tuned up fonts, which is perfect, because they're never going to have the web fonts load, but most of them do have JavaScript running. So they'll get that class injected in there, and they'll get our tuned up CSS and maintain the integrity of the design, even though they never get the web fonts. So let's talk about proportion. Let's move on to the next one. So proportion, this was something that I was writing about late last year and early in the beginning of this year, and it really struck me how big a difference this made. So when you start thinking about the proportion of headings to body copy across devices, what I was finding was that there really were a lot of changes that you needed to make, but you didn't want to make changes to body copy. So what do? There's a particular size relationship that's been popularized by people like Robert Bringhurst in his book, The Elements of Typographic Style, where headings should be 3 times the size of body copy. And so if your level 1 heading is 3 times the size, and then you sort of step down in orders of magnitude to get to what is your body copy size, what happens when the scale relationship starts to change with those headings to the whole page? Because all of what he recommends is based around the unit of a page and how everything fits proportionally within that. And our screens keep changing. So what I found was that there was a way, and there was a scale that seemed to work. So I started writing about this for Typecast, and the response to the article was pretty tremendous, that's the link in the lower right corner there. And so what I tried to do was illustrate this and give people a baseline set of numbers with which to work. So we have our desktop view screen here on the right, and we're looking at the different kinds of proportions that are in play there. And we're just trying to remind ourselves that desktop design, size, scale, and print actually are roughly comparable. So that was just fine to adapt that way. But as the screen sizes change, it really became important to think about it in a different way, because this is the view on the phone with the same size relationships applied to the type. And I think that looks really terrible, and I hope that a lot of you really agree with me. It's not just that they look really big and there's only 1 word per line and it looks a little ungainly, but you also get only 3 lines of text at the bottom. So it's not very helpful to the user to start to get into this content. But if we bring down the size relationship there, we still know exactly what the most important pieces of content are on the screen. We know what the meaning and intent is with those headings, but we now have a whole lot more content and a much more approachable experience for the end user. So this is what that scale ended up looking like. And don't worry about taking pictures of this. It's in the slides, so you can actually look at it there. I just kind of put it up here kind of for glorious effect. It goes from print to desktop designs and large desktops to different size tablets in the phone. And it looks at relationships in line height, line length, and type size, and ways that you might work with those elements across those different screen sizes to bring a little bit more harmony and proportion into your design. Which leads us on to polish. And there's a lot to talk about here, because I think there's a lot of nifty little tricks that really do add up to a much more enjoyable experience, and I want to make sure that we talk about a lot of them. So this is an example of a page that's using a couple of nice-looking typefaces. It's Salome up top, and then Fira Sans, which was designed by Eric Spiekerman for the Firefox OS, a really nice sans serif typeface. And they look good. There's really nothing wrong with this, but I think when we look at something like open type features, allows greater typographic control over the typeface and a little bit closer rendering to the intent of the type designer, that looks a lot better. So the spacing in the lettering is tightened up. We've got these nice ligatures connecting the I and the P or the C and the T. There's actually ligatures in Fira Sans available as well without any extra download. So there's a lot of nice little features that you can add if you have an OpenType enabled font that you can activate with a line or two of CSS, and the fallback is just the normal characters. So there's really no penalty other than sometimes a slightly larger font download. So you do have to balance these things out, but services like Cloud Typography from Huffler and Company actually allow you to embed only the OpenType features that you want, and it's still a highly compressed output. So it's still very usable on the web without a huge penalty in download. So OpenType features are really fantastic. And things like real fractions down there in that bottom line and these old-style figures where you see the 9 drops down below the baseline of the type, it sits in the midst of the text a lot more naturally. And all of these things are enabled without having to do anything on the content editing side. That's also really important because we work with Drupal. That's the content management system we use. But any CMS, you don't want to put the burden on the editor to get all these nice touches. So all the things that we're talking about here are ones that require virtually no code on the content entry. They're all in the way you're constructing the output in your CSS. So here's another thing, really nice typographic techniques that have been available to us on the web for a while, but they often get overlooked. So a large initial capital like this, setting off block quotes in that way, actually taking advantage of CSS columns to split a column into 2 once the screen gets large enough. Now, again, the nice fallback here is it will simply be 1 column if the browser doesn't support it, but it's really easy to, in a CMS, give the editor the ability to select a paragraph and add a class and have that then split. So it gives you a nice editorial touch, a little bit nicer design that comes down on a phone really naturally. So we've brought down the proportion of the initial cap, we've brought that split paragraph back into 1, and the block quote has slightly different margins. All of those things work across all these different breakpoints and devices without any intervention on the part of the editor of this content. Another thing that I get asked about a lot are orphans. And orphans are when you end up with 1 word on a line by itself at the end of a paragraph. And that's something that when you have a fluid canvas and a CMS where you don't know what the content is going to be, it's nearly impossible to deal with. And we want to make sure that we don't leave the orphans behind. So how can we do that? Well, there's actually a number of different ways that we can. If you're working with a CMS, then you can look at Typography. And there's a bunch of different links there to the original Django project, a Drupal module, a WordPress plugin, an expression engine extension, and then no, I think that's it. So 3 different CMSs and the original Django framework. What that does is it's a really interesting way of handling it. Before the page is served, it parses through your document and looks at all the p tags and inserts a non-breaking space between the last 2 words. So instead of, as the screen gets smaller, having that last word bump onto the next line, you get 2 words there. Really small, subtle difference, but if you're working with a real editor, they will probably kiss you when they see this, because this is one of the banes of their existence when they're looking at the way a publication goes out. And on the web, it's really hard to deal with, especially with all of these varying considerations for how it's rendered. But this works really seamlessly. The other way to do it is to try Widow Tamer, which is a JavaScript way of handling it, but it allows you to apply this function to any block level element, whether it's a paragraph, a block quote, or whatever you want, and specify the number of characters beyond the last word that you want to have on the last line. So if you say +2, it will make sure that there's always at least 2 more characters and then to the next word break on that next line. So you could ensure that you get at least 2 words there, or you could add more characters if you want to make sure you get at least 3. So it really gives you a lot of flexibility, and it's a really fun thing to play around with. That really seems small, but I'm telling you, I did a workshop for a bunch of publishers in New York a few months ago, and when I came to this, all the other technical cool stuff that I was talking about went completely out the window. That was the only thing they focused on. So I can't really understate how big a difference that will make in the level of polish in your sites just by dealing with that one little thing. There are a lot of other little touches that we can talk about, but I'm starting to run out of question time, so I want to keep plowing on. Something like maximum length lines on your paragraphs. As your design is scaling, you want to make sure the line length doesn't get so long that your text is hard to read. Consider setting a max width on a paragraph tag. It's really simple to do. You can adjust that number. There's no real science behind that other than somewhere between 70 and 90 characters tends to be a good line length for people to read. Some people say shorter, but on the web I think it's just fine for it to vary a little bit. So that makes sure that the gutter might grow, but your text will remain readable. It's easier for your eye to follow back to the beginning of the next line. There are a number of other measurement units coming. Some of them are supported, some of them are not in all the different browsers right now. I'm not convinced that those are really appropriate for typography. They're great for layout in some cases. Viewport height and viewport width, I think, are going to be really fantastic. CH and CX are really related to type character counts. They're just not evenly supported enough, and you can accomplish the same thing using Ms that are universally supported, so I tend to go in that direction. Ms or REMs for your measurement units. Personally, I don't see any reason to use REMs. I haven't ever needed it. I follow one simple rule. I don't ever put a measurement on a block level element in a design. I put it on the type element. So what the people get tripped up with Ms as a relative measurement of type because they do things like, I have my type set at 1M for body copy, 3M for headings, but in the sidebar I'm going to apply a font size of 0.75 Ms because I want to bring everything down on that side. Well, I've applied that number to the container, so whenever I try and do anything to the size of those elements inside, then I have to remember that it's only 75% of what I thought it was, and now I'm starting to do lots of weird math, where instead of applying that font size to the sidebar itself, only apply it to the paragraph, only apply it to the headings. Be more intentional with how you're sizing things, and you don't get into these issues. The problem with REMs is they're not supported in IE8 or below. And you can add a polyfill, but that's adding another JavaScript penalty on top of already having a crappy browser. So that's just being mean. And we have to remember that there's still about 20+% of the browsing public globally still using Windows XP. So that's a lot of Windows 8, IE8 users out there. And if that, you have to know your own audience. But the potential there is still there's a lot of people that have these issues. So you don't want to keep piling on the penalties for those people. So I just use Ms, and it works just fine. The other thing that I just like to bring up is when you're doing this work, it's not okay, it's not helpful to use lorem ipsum text. The reason it's not helpful is when you're evaluating your typography, you need to read it. You need to actually be able to sit down and read a page and see if that's going to work. And you can't do that when it's not natural language. It's also not going to flow in the same way as real text does. So grab a chapter or two of Moby Dick. That's what I usually do, and that's always kind of entertaining. Grab something. If you can't get real text from the client or from your colleague, just get something from some text that you can find online. Use that to set your copy and see if it really is working out and the size relationships are working. So a few other new tricks. There are some emerging attributes that you can look at in CSS called font size adjust and font smoothing. Font size adjust is supposed to help make the fallback fonts more closely match the metrics of the web font that was supposed to be there. The problem is it's incredibly unevenly supported and really unreliable. I tend to set that aside and go with adjusting font size and letter spacing in order to more closely resemble what's supposed to be there. But font smoothing is really pretty amazing. So it's just not all evenly supported enough. But what I found is typerendering.com, a site put together by Tim Brown and Bram Stein from Typekit. And what they were recommending is using this JavaScript polyfill to look at the text rendering engine that's in use. And so we can find out with a fair degree of certainty, is it core text on the Mac? Is it GDI on older versions of Windows or DirectWrite on newer versions of Windows? And we can apply some differences to how text is anti-aliased in order to get it to render a little bit more accurately. And this is generally only an issue when you have a font that's not actually well hinted for use on both platforms. But in many cases, what you'll find on the Mac is the text will render a little bit heavier. And we were finding that to be really just more than we wanted to live with on a project recently. So this is our little true life story. If you look at the way academics is set top left and bottom right, it looks okay. But it was really noticeable to us that it was a little heavier. This is a typeface based on Garamond, designed by Matthew Carter, who's a really wonderful type designer, and we wanted to make sure that the design was true to his intent. So what we found was that if we changed the anti-aliasing only on the Mac, what we ended up with this. Small shift, but the lines are finer. It's truer to the original intent of the design, and it was literally those 2 lines to put in there. And using type rendering, we are able to only apply this to an element that is drawn with the core text rendering engine, meaning it's on a Mac, in those 2 browsers. And that was the exact condition that we needed to deal with. 2 lines of CSS was all we had to do. I mean, it was really super easy, and it made a huge difference when you're looking in the context of the whole page every time we used that typeface. So I want to bring all this stuff together with a little experiment that I did a couple weeks ago for a workshop. I was looking at the typography in one of my wife's magazines, Vanity Fair, and they really do a beautiful job. I've not read the magazine that much, but I like looking at it when she's looking at it because I think the pages are really well laid out and they have great typography. And they have all these really interesting elements. But the frustration was when you look at it online, this is how they interpreted it for the phone and the web. And I think they were really leaving a lot on the table. So what I wanted to do was see if we could do a better job. And this was just using some fonts that I could find on Google Web Fonts. So it's not their exact fonts that they're using, but it's relatively close. And I wanted to make sure that we could actually realize this in a meaningful way. Now, again, that's what I created in a few hours. So it really wasn't a ton of time that went into doing this. But I think it is far closer to their original editorial intent in the way they designed their magazine in a page that works really well everywhere. It's got the oversized 2-level header. It's got a stylized subhead. It has the stylized byline. It has a great initial cap. It's got some inset photos and captions, a really nicely set pull quote, and there's hardly any additional markup needed in here. There were 2 places where a class had to be applied, and that was it. And it's fully responsive, so it works beautifully across all the devices. And you'll be able to take a look at that yourself. But this is how that ended up working out. And I think that what we have here is a pretty attainable and sustainable way of designing their content that's far closer to their original editorial intent than what they ended up with in real life as it is. So that was all of those things together, meaning bringing back around to what is responsive typography. How do we make sure that we're reacting to everything and adapting to the environment in which our stuff is being experienced? It's remembering that we're designing not for what's now, but also for what's next, and making sure that we're being careful and mindful about how we mark things up. We're not polluting our markup. We're using CSS that's clean and has good fallbacks. We're in an Olympic year. Go back to the previous Winter Olympics, there was no iPad. Go back one more Olympic cycle after that, there was no iPhone either. Think about that. And now we have yet another device that just came out that's going to bring with it another set of typographic concerns and design considerations in an even smaller form factor. We need to make sure that what we're thinking about how we present type and how we carry around the intent and meaning of our design is as portable and flexible as possible. Type is the way we do that. So, performance, progression, proportion, and polish. That is our 4 Ps of responsive typography. And so I will close with this quote from a friend of mine that I met in the spring. I just say real designer's code, and I just leave it at that. I think this was a much nicer and more artful way of putting it. And that ties in nicely with the fact that I worked really hard to put all of the stuff I've been talking about today into that. And that is available from O'Reilly now. It's at the press right now. You can buy it as an ebook or you can get it in print. And in the meantime, you can get slides and all of the code that goes into the workshop with all the things I demonstrated at that link right there. Thank you very much. And I probably have like 30 seconds for questions, so I'm sure there's got to be something.
You mentioned that you style by elements specifically, like on a paragraph or a list item. I'm wondering you personally would handle nested list items? It's 0.75 ems. It's going to...
So the question is about how you apply sizing to elements that might be nested, and I think you really need to think about descendant selectors in that case. So you can do things like styling any paragraph that follows another paragraph, or styling only the immediately nested UL. So if you do things like that, so you can make sure that you're applying the style and not having it sort of recursively get worse. So it is possible. I've just been given the big 0, so if anybody else wants to ask me some questions, please feel free to come on down. Thank you.